Welcome. I am Jason Kelly. I am the director of the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute. We're really pleased to have you here tonight for the opening of Rebecca Allan's Fjord, Glacier River. This is the first installation of an exhibition that will expand in June to twice the size. It will be over in the Marsh Gallery. So you're getting the core collection here, but lots of good stuff is still coming, so we're really excited about it. The IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute was founded in 2012. We have a twofold mission. First, we're here to support faculty research and creative activity on campus. We do that a number of ways, one of which is through our grant program. We give out grants to faculty at the $5,000, $15,000, and $30,000 levels, and they do wonderful work with it. If you go to our website, you'll see some of the excellent productions that our faculty have done in music, in painting, in sculpture, in writing books and articles. It's absolutely fascinating, the stuff that they produce. The second thing that we do is serve as a liaison for the university community with the public. And we do all kinds of interesting events, including lectures and performances. Some of our partners, like Big Car, are here today. Jim Poyser is here today from Earth Charter, Indiana. We just did 2 events in the last 24 hours together, so we're constantly doing things.
Still love you.
Still love each other.
This exhibition has been supported by the Arts and Humanities Institute, but also a project that the Institute runs called Rivers of the Anthropocene. I'm not going to explain all of that with you right now, but I encourage you to pull some of the cards at the front of the exhibition so you can learn more about the exhibition, you can learn about the Rivers of the Anthropocene Project, more about Rebecca, and more about the iahi. The Heron School of Art and Design has been so generous with their space and their time, and particularly I'd like to thank Colin Nesbitt and Mike Barkley, who have just been so wonderful to work with in getting this exhibition together. And finally, I'd like to introduce our guest, Rebecca Allan. I've known Rebecca since 2007, when Rebecca invited me to New York City as part of an art exhibition at the Bard Graduate Center. And since then, we have been in pretty much constant contact doing one thing or another with each other. This is just the most recent iteration of that. I adore Rebecca's work, and I hope you do as well. I'm going to stop talking because I think Rebecca should share her work with you, but please join me in welcoming Rebecca Allan.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you, Jason. It's such an honor to be here. I really, together with my partner, Laura, we are just grateful for this invitation and for the friendship of Kristen and Jason and the expanding friendships that have started to come out of the work that we're doing together. I am going to talk about some of the work in the exhibition, and I would really like to invite everyone in to look at the paintings and the works more closely, because for me, painting is a very intimate practice. It's a relationship. It's a relationship with the tools and the materials of my work and the ideas that feed the work, and it's also a relationship with the people who experience the work. So even though many visual artists are radical introverts, like myself, it's most rewarding to have an opportunity to see people looking at the work and have conversations about what that experience is. And really for the last 25 years, my work has been generated from a relationship to landscape. I grew up in Ohio and also in Western New York, close to the Great Lakes. My family actually also, we lived outside of Chicago for a few years when I was a kid, and so I had proximity to I can't think of the Great Lake that Chicago sits on now. Lake Michigan. There was Lake Erie, Lake Michigan, and Lake Michigan were two lakes that were very much part of my early life. And creeks and rivers were also a part of that experience, because when I was growing up, we would go hiking, and my mom and dad would take my brothers and I on hikes along various creeks, and we learned to fish for tadpoles and crayfish and experience nature very directly. So that's very much a part of my early experiences. But when I finished graduate school at Kent State University in Ohio, I lived in Cleveland for a while and worked with the Cleveland Center for Contemporary Art and the Cleveland Museum of Art, and I began to work in do museum work, most specifically in museum education. And that work took me to Seattle in 1990, where I established the art studio program at the Seattle Art Museum. So that happened at a time in my life when I had never seen big mountains and big rivers before. So moving out to the Pacific Northwest introduced me to a whole and larger scale of landscape and landscape history that took me many years to understand, and I'm still thinking about those years. We moved from Seattle to New York 11 years ago, so my rivers now are the Harlem River and the Hudson River and the Bronx River. So as an artist, what I've always gravitated toward is to try to harness the experience of the landscape through sketching. And it's a time-honored tradition of artists dating back even before the Enlightenment, who have carried sketchbooks into the land and recorded their experiences. So in the case, thank you, Laura Kaminsky, for curating this case. There are a few sort of working documents that I have. This is kind of like what my studio table looks like in the Bronx, that there may be a sketchbook open to a page from the fjords in Norway, there may be photographs, and there are cards from previous exhibitions, as well as the actual materials that I might be working with physically on any given day. And so these photographs in this side of the case come from the Pacific Northwest. And is there anyone here who's been to Oregon, Seattle, Victoria, Vancouver, that part of the world? Well, you know those mountains are very big, and the glaciers in the North Cascades are quite dramatic. And these experiences happened over a period of about 10 years of hiking and working up in the North Cascades and documenting not just what we see from a distance, but also looking very closely at the material in the river. And I became very interested in understanding what happens when a river floods its banks and what happens to the material upstream when it comes downstream. Because part of the work that I did when I was in Seattle was to work with the Washington State Arts and Education Program, and I traveled around the state of Washington as a teaching artist. And one of the most meaningful experiences for me was working with a community in Mount Baker and with Nooksack Indian community who monitored the Nooksack River and had so many revealing stories about what happened when the river floods every season. So these are photographs from that experience. And then on this part of the case, you can see my folded landscapes, and these are landscapes that are kind of in progress. These aren't finished yet. But a lot of us who are in the arts get things in the mail and exhibition announcements, and we get so many that it's overwhelming and we can't get to everything. So one of the things I decided to do was just paint it out and to use the format of the folded card as a frame or a device as a starting point for these small painted studies. And so in some cases you can see with a couple of the works on the wall, the small landscape in the upper left-hand corner is done on an exhibition card from the Yale Center for British Art about Dutch landscape painting. So the part of the image is revealed through the paint, and I wanted to show that I was thinking about not just the Dutch landscape, but also as an homage to a colleague of mine, Walter Lidke, who was a longtime curator of Dutch and Flemish painting at the Metropolitan Museum, who died in a train accident in New York a couple of months ago. And Walter's appreciation for what landscape painting meant to the 17th century Dutch viewer and to people who look at the landscape today was very special to me, and I remember many encounters with him and talking about why it was important to continue to work in that tradition. Now, the larger works, a lot of people that experience these works ask about the sort of different approaches in my paintings, and it's true, the smaller landscapes, even the ones that are behind Jason, the canvases that were inspired by a trip to Norway, these are approached in a slightly different way. You know, these small paintings are very much about a love of paint and the texture of paint and a desire to reflect the horizon line and to anchor myself in the world in a way that relates to seeing space at various distances. And I think that painters and photographers, visual artists have always investigated the world vis-a-vis where they are standing, both physically and also symbolically. Most of the time, my experience of the physical world is just an experience of awe. I'm in awe of it all the time, and it's very difficult to verbalize. So for me, painting is a language that comes very naturally. And so these landscapes technically are made in several different ways. You know, when I think about my process, there's a lot of chemistry involved, of mixing color and working with pigment and mixing pigment with medium, and the very traditional techniques that go back to the Middle Ages of working with egg tempera, or egg yolk, and pigment. So the pigment comes from the earth, and the yolk is what binds the pigment together. These aren't done with egg tempera, but I have worked with egg tempera. These are all acrylic as well as peel collage. So in some of these landscapes, you'll see skins of paint, just like the ones in the case. This is a peel that are peeled up from the surface of my palette. And the acrylic paint dries, and you can spray it with water and then take a razor blade and just gently roll it and carefully handle it and then flatten it out on another surface until it's dried, and then use that as an element of collage. Finding this technique was a matter of accident, and I was talking with one of the faculty members here, Danielle, about working with paint. And it just happened because I would scrape my palette at the end of the day, and all of that color would end up in the garbage. And one day I looked in the garbage and thought, why am I wasting this beautiful material? And so it took some sort of thinking. In the first stages of working with the peels, I would transfer them into a pan full of water so that I would see what they would do, and then lift them and then dry them. As it happens, the peels, let me find a peel, here's a peel. The peels have started to go into larger scale, and I'm now depending on them in a way, because in working at this scale, there has to be a reason to go big. I want there to be a compelling reason to create an abstract landscape at 60 by 60 inches. And what I find is that the peels create a different dimension, not only of texture, but also of space, automatically. And it's sometimes much more challenging to do that just with the alchemy of paint, of the brush as a tool. So the peel automatically creates a kind of broken space. What were we talking about today in the workshop about problematizing language, problematizing language. So the peel problematizes the surface of the canvas at moments when I'm either stuck or I want to shift to a different dimension. And I often will work on the floor with these so that I'm seeing what's going on from above. This is called Amethyst Fjord. And both of these paintings, Amethyst Fjord and Tangle of Valleys, as well as Lavender Gray Fjord and Cobalt and Gray Fjord, came out of a trip that we took to Norway, and driving 15 hours from Oslo all the way up to a small village called Terak, where we were working. And my first experience of going that far up in the Earth's dimension was that it was very frightening to look down. And we were quite close to the edge. And when you're looking over the edge of a fjord, you're afraid for your life. So you really have to watch your footing. And the more I came back to the studio after drawing and thinking about beginning these paintings, I realized that that's exactly what life is like every day for most of us. That we're confronted with experience that brings us to the edge of ourselves and brings us to the edge of and the capacity of what we can do. So I've been fascinated with the concept of the vortex, of falling, of tumbling, of gravity, and that's what's happening with these spaces within these paintings, is they have become either places that we're falling into or we're coming out of spatially. The palette of these three paintings really centers on the blue-violet and the red-violet spectrum. And it's interesting because Colin and I were having a conversation earlier today about moonlight, and Colin was telling me about his investigations into what happens when we're in moonlight, and that when we have low light at night, our color cells in our eyes sort of shut down, and we see most things in black and white or very low color. But that in moonlight, we often think of things as blue. And these paintings, in fact, were generated from the experience of being in Norway during a time when it was light the entire night. And we could see, everything, even well up until 4 in the morning, because the sun doesn't go all the way down below the horizon. So now I'm thinking more about how can I express these ideas with the most limited palette and only working within a very narrow range of gray and blue-gray and lavender. This painting began almost entirely in a lavender palette, and even though we see lavender and blue violets in it now, I pushed a lot of that back. Probably 75% is underneath, is an underpainting that we can't see anymore. And one of the more sort of interesting things to me about the process of painting is that as you build up thin layers of color, the color field is shifting. And I mentioned color field because my heroes are some of the color field painters like Helen Frankenthaler and Kenneth Noland. and Morris Lewis, who were working on unprimed canvas and who were using color to soak directly into the fibers of the canvas and creating a unity of the material. Today, whenever I work with layering in this canvas, for example, I'm still so amazed at how yellow, for example, is a transparent color, and that if you want to communicate an experience or a sense of opacity with yellow, you have to use many, many transparent layers to make it opaque. So in the process of painting, there are paradoxes that come up again and again. This is called Bronx River Reverie, and this painting started its life as an idea, as a recollection of a walk that we took in the New York Botanical Garden. Remember that, Laura? And part of the landscape in the New York Botanical Garden is a woodland area. Did you guys go? You remember. And the woodland area leads you to an overview of the Bronx River. And the Bronx River literally cuts through the landscape like this. So I'm looking down, and this is the river. And this is the effervescence of the river. And this is a geometric element that speaks about my love of late medieval and early Renaissance architecture and painting, and the way that those artists harness the world that they were looking at through geometry, through the language of math and geometry. But this is also a painting that's made through my friendships, my imaginary friendships with painters like Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning and others who were working, Joan Mitchell, who were working with pure abstraction. And so the last decision, there are peels here, the last decision that I've made with respect to finishing these canvases is to use varnish. And I'm using varnish to create a sparkly texture at the very end as a way to pop these paintings. The other thing that happens over a period of time is with layering, the color sometimes sinks back and the varnish can pull it back up to the surface. So it's also a technical decision. Does anyone have any questions? I mean, just pop in if you have questions or comments, because I'm happy to.
I have a question.
Yes, sure.
I'm so fascinated about this concept of the peel.
The peels,
And,
right.
I'm a colleague across the street in the School of Liberal Arts
Great.
in the Department of English. And there's a concept when we teach poetry about the found poem. Which is something that you might see in a magazine, perhaps, or a newspaper, or on a sign. Suddenly you see this conjunction of words that seems quite lyrical and could exist, you know, excerpted as a kind of poem.
Right.
And I was struck as you were talking about the process by which this peel occurred to you, that, you know, you've been throwing it all away, and then you realized, oh, this is found art, that it's really quite analogous.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I mean, I think the deeper we move into our work, the more we see. And what's occurred for me in the last few years is that just making decisions to allow for me to have more time painting have meant a much quieter day. And that, I think, is connected with seeing things that might have been discarded or were just incidental. And now even working with Mary Miss and getting to know the work that she's done here and in New York City about seeing the rivers underground Broadway Avenue, I'm much more determined to spend time to see things that I may not have looked for before, even in the incidental spaces. Thank you for that wonderful question about found poems. Another sort of thing that comes to mind is that the work of Charles Birchfield, who was a painter, a Western New York painter, who worked in from the 1930s into the 1960s and 70s. Birchfield was a kind of pantheistic painter, and he saw in nature God. His God was really in nature, and he developed a rubric of symbols and signs within his paintings that spoke to various aspects of the sensate environment. And he was a great journal keeper, so I've followed and read a lot of his journals, and that has inspired me. So, any other questions or? Yes?
I've got one. I remember going to the Kandinsky Museum and following from literal to abstract.
Yeah.
The early paintings were and it helped me as a non-painter myself.
Sure.
A non-educated painter.
I get that. Yeah.
It helped me get to the abstract.
Yeah.
And looking just off the top of my head, I'm looking at that one, the
Yeah.
fluorescent thing.
Yeah.
And the island over there
Yeah.
are the more literal ones.
Yeah, very much so.
That are easily accessible to non-educated people like myself.
Yeah, yeah,
And just you saying that that's looking from above
yeah,
changes how I look at that painting.
yeah.
So I
yeah.
guess if it's a question, my question is, how does the, walking in, I mean, it's changed my way of looking at it from hearing you talk about it.
Yeah.
But how does the uneducated eye get to that? Or does it need that nudge of education?
I think education and dialogue is really critical. And although I don't think that you necessarily need information to appreciate or enjoy the experience of looking at abstract works of art, I think that the dialogue and the educational dimension can enrich the experience and maybe point us toward what the artist was thinking and where the artist was beginning. Because you're right, I mean, the process of abstraction is to extract, to remove the essence of an experience, like with a spice. We extract. And you might not see that this is about a view from above, nor is it that important for me that you do with these larger works. I want my viewers to have a lot of pleasure when they see these paintings. That's important to me. You know, there's a lot of conversation about works of art that repel or draw us in. And for me, beauty is such an important value. I think it softens us, to use one of Jim's words, and it helps us to enter contemplative space that leads to other ways of living. So yes, there's a vortex in there, and I'm looking from above, and I'm turning things around and on their head, but there's also a color temperature that I'm working with in any given canvas and trying to evoke a recollection of a tropical landscape or an Arctic landscape or a Western New York forest. So those elements are also in there. But I do think that the dialogue can enrich the experience. It's not necessary, but it's enriching. Yeah. So, yes?
How do you outline your paintings through different dimensions? And I love how it's like you're speaking to us, like you discovered something that you're speaking to us through. It's really beautiful. How do you outline it through many different dimensions that we can relate to?
I start with very large fields of color, although my sketchbooks are open, and I'm thinking, oh, I really want to capture that waterfall. That is a really compelling experience. That is something that has to come through. You know, it had to come through. There are rocks in those photographs that I really wanted to come through in this drawn passage of the striations in the rocks. But on the canvases, I start with large swaths of color. They're usually of a certain temperature, and I'll wake up and think, today it's got to be about yellow. And that's the only idea that I have that day. It's, it's sort of simple. It's very basic. I need to do a painting that's about the green of the mosses in the Pacific Northwest. That's a starting point, and then that gets thrown out for something else. So what you might not sense in these is there are a lot of things that are discarded. They might be painted over or scraped away. Because this is a wrestling match with work. We all do work that involves discipline and effort, and making paintings is wrestling with yourself, with your own limits psychologically and technically. And so for me, laying out a color field of large areas of color and then going back and drawing into it and then painting into it and drawing over it and painting into it in those sequences is how I work. And part of it too is stepping back and being able to see there are cohesive forms that establish a composition here. And trying to find those cohesive areas is an important part of bringing a work to its completion. That it's not just about scattered random mark making for me. No, it's about loading these canvases up with as much material as I have and then wrestling them to the ground so that there is some sense of gravity and balance and anchor within. There's a dispersion of activity in this canvas, but there are places where you are moved through the canvas, just like you're moved through the landscape. And the work that I do is really wrestling to, first of all, to just see that with my eyes, to be able to perceive it visually, and then to manipulate the tools of my trade to anchor those things. So this gray is many layers over this green, and because there was a problem, the green wasn't working. It had to be cooled down. The green was too vibrant. So painting is about, as Hans Hofmann used to say, pushing and pulling, and wrestling with those forces to try to come to some kind of dynamic balance. And you mentioned something earlier when we were talking about the experimental nature of work, and there isn't. I think if you're willing to take risks, you're always going to have a degree of experimentation in your work, and it's not always comfortable. Yeah. I don't mean to end on a down note, but I want to end on an up note. So anyway, why don't we just look and have informal conversation, and if people have other questions, let's come and talk. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Rebecca one last time.
My pleasure.